what should have been 15 minutes, but was actually 35. Which only means that lunch will be delayed. But anyway, so our second panel is focuses on the northeastern region of India, and it's called Lost and Found in Translation. And we have a number of speakers here, very Chandra-like, very large panel. So it's going to stretch for a while. Please do sort of stay focused and be attentive, because I think every writer has something really important to say. I will not take a lot of your time except to say that thinking of the Northeast as a region, as many writers and translators from that area will tell you, is quite problematic because, in a sense, it wipes out the huge diversity that exists not only in those 8 states, the 7 sisters plus typically the one brother who came last, Sikkim. It's like everyone was birthing sisters waiting for the boy to come along. And also the contiguous regions of Kalimpong, Darjeeling, Kurseong, which actually technically belong to Bengal, but ethnically and culturally are so much closer to the northeastern states. So one thing is just looking at that region as a whole. What do you see and what is rendered invisible? And clearly the more powerful cultures and the larger states then have a more important voice. And in terms of writing, also those parts of the northeastern states that write in English or use the Roman script, their works travel much more. And then within the region, say for example in Assam or in other places, you have many minority languages which actually don't get that much attention. So as Assamia would, or Kokborok, or from the Karbi Anglong region, etc. These languages also there is an internal power dynamics that goes on, and there is an external power dynamics that goes on. And then the political framing of the northeastern region as the periphery, which sort of puts it somewhere out there, and its representation by and large in literature and in writing and in journalism as a region which is perennially caught in conflict, and which takes away from the fascinating dailiness of the exchange of cultures, the traditions that are there, the many writings, the theater, and basically the richness of the multiple cultures of the region are wiped out, and seeing it mainly as a region of conflict. So a lot of the writing from the Northeast that has actually been visible has been writing that focuses by and large on conflict, on notions of home, migration, belonging, etc., and is academic writing. And creative writing, narrative nonfiction has kind of taken a backseat until recently, when more and more publishers are picking up works from the Northeast to now publish, which is a welcome move and really something that should have happened a long time ago, because we are learning so much also from writings from the Northeast. So in that context, we have a number of people who will be speaking today. We actually have 10 speakers in this panel. And we will start with some introductory notes. The writer from Assam, Mitra Phukan, should have been here to introduce the panel, but Mitra is unable to come because of a medical emergency that she has had to go through. She did send us a paper, and I will just read some parts of it because it's quite long, so if I don't want to read it all, but I'm sure that the book review can make it available to those of you who wish to read the whole thing. And then we will turn to other speakers. On my left is Shibani Phukan. Shibani has actually, as those of you who are speaking on the panel know, she's the one who's actually put this panel together and thought of the ways, the divisions, etc., which she has set as subject areas that we are going to ask you to speak on. You've all seen that. So Shibani and I are going to moderate this together. Chandra, I'm just letting you know now so you can't do anything about it, okay? Shibani, okay? Yes? All right. So I'll start by reading bits of Mitra's paper. She apologizes for not being able to be here. And she says that in seminars and classrooms, we look at translation as a literary activity. But what should not be overlooked is the fact that people around the world are what I would call natural translators. Many on this planet have a working knowledge of at least 2 languages. There is a human need to communicate that transcends the boundaries of language. This is especially true in areas such as marketplaces. Trade takes place through language, and people of the business communities are the first to learn the language of the place when there is a profitable trade. She also points to places like hospitals and other places where people translate almost naturally from languages they don't know, understanding the needs of people. She goes on to say, we mustn't forget that languages have porous boundaries. Words and phrases travel from and through languages through a constant process of translation, though we do not think of it as a formal thing. But that enriches the donor and the recipient languages both, and translation is to a large extent responsible for this exchange. Perhaps then, she says, the human brain is wired for translation. Not necessarily literary or even written, but it is all kinds of communication that come from the human brain. In India's northeast, there are at least 200 distinct ethnic groups, each with its own culture, tradition, history, weaves, cuisines, and yes, languages. Over millennia, there have been migrations in this region from Tibet, from the Himalayas, and further east, Myanmar, and through the area from Thailand, and also in more recent times from the west, that is, from the rest of India, which he uses in quotation marks. This is therefore a region of complex multicultural societies. There are numerous sub-languages, the variants that also constitute living linguistic entities. For centuries, language and culture in this region has developed in isolation, distinct from each other, since most communities, especially in the high mountain regions of the area, were cut off from each other and therefore had to be self-sufficient in many respects. But gradually, as the area opened up, there was exposure to different cultures and languages, and of course, much else. Translation, oral and as well as written, therefore became a necessity. Across these hills and valleys of India's northeast, some of the earliest formal translations were those related to religion. Stories from the Hindu epics were translated and retold. Buddhist verses had to be explained through translation. Biblical stories and parables were translated in simple language for non-Christians. From these rose over time translations of the classics of Western literature. In Assamese, the late 19th and early 20th centuries had space for these translations in the popular journals of the time. Among the many tongues of India's northeast, there is always the question of which is the, what she calls, power language. Language in this region is not simply a mode of communication, it is also a subject loaded with political overtones. There have been huge political repercussions over the use of language. Over the years, it has been seen, at least in this region, that translations tend to be from the power language of the time to what is perceived to be the language with less clout. This is political as well as cultural. And she points out that at one time, the power language in much of the northeast, especially in Assam, was Bangla. There were translations, literary as well as other essays from this language. Later, the influence of Bangla waned and power language became English and to an extent Hindi. Translations from the English classics into, say, Assamese were numerous and competent. In Arunachal, for instance, earlier writers could write in as well as translate from Assamese. That was the power language. I've added that phrase, not her. But today, Hindi is the power language there, and writers as well as translators work with texts in this language. There is also the reverse that happens, that is into the power language, but it's not as common. The thing about translations happening in this region are the shifting political dynamics. The Bodoland territorial region, an autonomous region within Assam, has its own literature in the Bodo language. It has adopted the Devanagari script, and as a result, people reading in Bodo are much more familiar with Hindi than with the language of the state itself, which is Assamese, which has a different script. Bodo translations have catapulted writings in the language straight into the power language, Hindi as well as English. Of course, there are poets and fiction writers who do write in Assamese and translate into this language too, but now the option to be heard by a much larger audience is an inducement and a choice. It's a sad truth, actually, that intra-regional translations are becoming, if anything, less common. It is through English, Hindi, and to an extent Bangla that we are becoming aware of the rich diversity of the literature, both oral and written, of our region and our neighboring literatures. But that, she says, I suppose, is better than nothing. One of the interesting developments in recent times in the area of translation comes from the fact that many writings from the region are originally written in English. The reasons for this are many and merit a different examination, but intriguingly, these books in English are sometimes translated into the mother tongue of the writer herself. Perhaps one can call this a kind of reverse translation. Several of my own books, she says, including children's books and the novel A Monsoon of Music, which incidentally was published by Zuban, so let me give it a little publicity. We also did her first novel, The Collector's Wife, which is a stunning novel, which was purchased by a film company to make into a film, but they never did it. So it's really opportunity lost because it's a very, very filmic novel. So several of my own books, including A Monsoon of Music, have been translated into my mother tongue Assamese. In any case, even though I write in English, all my books are strongly rooted in Assam, so perhaps it does make sense for readers to access them in our common mother tongue. An important aspect of translating India's Northeast rises from the fact that much of the history of its literature is oral. There are strong oral traditions which still exist parallel to the written word even today. The creation myths of Arunachal, the mythologies of the Boros and Missings, the warrior narratives of Nagaland, are all extremely important. The act of putting down this oral literature in writing itself constitutes an act of translation. The written word, while valuable, cannot convey all that the voice, the body language, the tonal variations can through oral literature. There is loss as well as gain in the process, and what I call translation into the written language. The amorphous beauty of the orality becomes more rigid in the written version, but that is a loss that perhaps has to be traded for the fact that without this, the entire story, the legend or the myth would be lost. In addition, there is the process of transferring these legends into myths into languages such as Hindi and English through stories. The myths live, but within the light scaffolding of the imagined stories. Is this translation? In a way, I feel yes, it is, because these myths and legends have not been translated into other languages yet. They live within the embrace of the larger story. The Arunachali writer Subi Taba's recent collection of stories, Tales from the Dawn-Lit Mountains, and many of Eastereen Keir's stories from Nagaland have this strong component of myths. They are creating fiction, yes, but intertwined with them are the translations of stories of myths and legends that have hitherto not found their way into any written language. Now that literary translations have finally been recognized as a valid creative endeavor, it is heartening to see the changes for the better. As we move from the earlier translations to the contemporary ones in our languages, one thing becomes apparent: the confidence with which the translator herself moves between the target and the source language. Relationship terms, for instance, are not explained. It is left to the reader to understand through the context in which they occur to figure it out. Cultural and traditional activities are beautifully set forth in translation so that the relevance and meaning of these rituals and faiths are made accessible to readers from another culture and another language. Thankfully, Vasanta, where are you? She says, thankfully, the use of footnotes has diminished. I thought you might like to hear that since you were talking about that. Previously, the rampant use of these tools made reading a work of fiction seem like it was a research paper. In recent translations, this seems to be on the wane. This is the end of Mitra's paper. She has several references to weaving as an act of translation and various other things which I have left out because it would take too much time to read. So please do read the whole paper. And without further ado, we take some of her remarks about orality, about the written word, about the power language and other languages, about the political context in which translations survive, as the basic rubric of some of our discussions. And I will now ask Shibani to come in and present her paper. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I should have introduced you. Oh, my apologies. I was so. Hmm? Time factor. Yeah, I'll do it quickly, briefly. So, others when they speak. All right. Okay. Shibani is an associate professor in the Department of English at ARSD College in Delhi. She is interested in writing from the Northeast, women's writing and translation studies. She's a poet, she's a writer, and she has done chapters in on the Northeast and translation studies in national and international journals. One of her significant contributions to translation studies includes an essay titled Towards an Indian Theory of Translation that was published in the journal Wasafiri. Shibani, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I think there are some overlaps with what Mitra Baido has to say. Hopefully, I'll take the conversation forward. The Northeast is a directional place name, one that came into usage during British colonialism for administrative purposes. The sheer internal diversity in Northeast India is mind-boggling, with credible estimates putting the number of languages spoken in the region of about 220. So when we use the category of the Northeast, the inevitable glossing over of the diversity needs to be clearly recognized, but perhaps one can also resort to strategic essentialism to ensure that the Northeast makes an entry into mainstream discourse on translation and translation studies in India. The linguistic diversity of the Northeast is undeniable, and given this fact, the need for translation becomes a necessity, a pursuit that is not necessarily always academic in nature, but born out of an everyday need to communicate. To understand translation practices in the Northeast in contemporary times, a historical perspective is important. In Assam, translation is an activity engaged by saints and scholars predates medieval times, but translations gather momentum only with the advent of British colonialism, the setting up of a printing press in Sibsagar in Assam, and the translation of the Bible into various languages of the region. The translation of the Bible brought about a standardization and modernization of languages such as Assamese. The Mizos got their present Roman script in the year 1894, and the Baptist missionaries, because of their intervention, one sees the invention of a script for Khasi. But an unfortunate outcome was that the polyglot linguistic diversity, reflective of cultural and ethnic diversity, faced a very regrettable effacement. Those like Margaret Zama lament that many dialects gradually died a natural death, or its usage became even further limited. Interestingly, translation strategies adopted to translate the Bible into as many languages as possible also resulted in the reinforcement of subgroup divisions and gave rise to new linguistic identities, alienated the tribes from a history of orality, and led to a sense of differentiation, exclusiveness, and ethnocentrism. Translation of the Bible impacted the growth of languages, dialects, and literature differently in the various states and is greatly responsible for their uneven development. The effect of that is seen till date and in the choice of language writers choose to write in and the volume of literature published or translated from the various states. Thus, a hierarchy of languages was created, with those like Assamese or Manipuri drawing more attention than the languages at play in the Northeast. A similar hierarchy functions at the level of the state too. For example, Bodo, the language spoken by the largest Plains tribe in Assamese, continued to be marginalized till recently. But these hierarchies are also fluid and dynamic. Not only is Bodo literature thriving, but so are translations between Bodo and Assamese. And in fact, one is beginning to see Bodo translations into English as well. In Arunachal Pradesh, Assamese was the chosen medium, as has been mentioned by many well-known writers. And then, of course, Hindi became a medium of instruction, which resulted in a shift. But Tilottama Mishra mentions how now there is a shift towards English in this pursuit of modernity. Suffice to say, the relationship between languages in the Northeast is a complicated one. The adoption of English to write and to translate into has only further upset the power dynamics between the languages. While organizations such as the Sahitya Academy have been responsible for a while for making available writing in regional literature in English and vice versa, it is a relatively recent phenomena of publishing houses such as Zuban, Aleph, Penguin, etc., which has slowly but surely made literature from the Northeast widely available in English translations. LitFest also have generated interest, among other things. This development spells out that increasingly translations from the Northeast are being seen as a viable proposition for big publishing houses. Does it translate to a larger volume of works of translation being published? That's difficult to ascertain and also raises the question of whether we are seeing more translations because they are being marketed better. What is conclusive is that translation is being viewed as work that requires a specific skill set and expertise that may not necessarily match those required to be a writer. So unlike 10 or 15 years ago, we have very few translations of works done by the author himself or herself. For example, Indira Goswami's earliest works were translated by her. There are writers who translate but not so their own writing. And there are writers who choose to work in close partnership with specific translators. Example, Arupa Patangya Kalita often works with Ranjita Biswas. When we talk about translating literature from the Northeast, one must understand that oral literature is an integral aspect of our literature. The growth of print capitalism led to the beginning of publication of journals, popularized a culture of writing, publishing, reading to some extent. However, it also resulted in the growing dominance of the written over the oral and the establishment of a hierarchy too. That hierarchy continues to play a role in matters of translation too. It is necessary to acknowledge that if translations or any study of translations from the Northeast focuses only on the written tradition and interlingual translation, much of the richness of any literary tradition from the region would be irrevocably lost. Equally worse would be the fact that one's understanding of literature from the Northeast would remain limited, ignorant of the multiplicities of songs, myths, practices, aesthetics, dialects, ethnicities, traditions, and other diversities embedded in the very orality of these literary traditions. But as Professor Asaduddin perceptively points out, that while one cannot elide over the fact that many cultures and practices in the Northeast are available only through the spoken or the oral, it is also an unfortunate fact that those belonging to those very traditions may be in a position to access them only in English today. But how does one preserve that orality in translation? That is perhaps where post-colonial theories and approaches towards translations come in handy with enabling disruptive ideas such as the notion of thick translation. Are there dominant themes, tropes that emerge when we look at translated works from the Northeast? A glance through recently translated work reveals an overwhelming urge to translate those that narrativize the history of Northeast. This urge is perhaps best explained by the complete erasure that history from the Northeast faces. The other is a focus on writing that examines violence and years of insurgency that the Northeast has borne the brunt of, and its troubled relation with the nation state. Interestingly, most works chosen for translation are those that adopt a stance of resistance and look at those impacted as survivors, not victims. A couple of noteworthy emergent areas of focus seem to be a focus on planetarity, writing that revisits the partition and its impact on the Northeast, and those that explore dissident sexualities. Queer writing from the Northeast is something that has become very, very visible and interesting. The task of a translator working with writing from the Northeast is not an easy one. Given the complexity of the Northeast, a translator may well be persuaded to explain the Northeast to the rest of the world to make it more accessible. It is this tendency to simplify that perhaps needs to be kept at bay so as not to erase the complexity. Any failure to do so can be rightly construed as giving in to the power dynamics that not only dictates what is literature, but what counts as Indian literature, or even more significantly, who is an Indian. Translation is a political act, and it is therefore significant that most writing chosen for translation strategically, subversively challenge any attempt at homogenizing the Northeast or a particular region. and refuses to cater to certain expectations that the mainland in particular has with regard to what counts as literature from the Northeast.
Thank you so much, Shibani, and thank you brilliantly keeping to time. You, in fact, finished 1 minute before your allocated time. So someone else can have the credit of that 1 minute, which I think is great. Well, thank you for laying the ground for, I think, the discussions that will follow. One, in building on also the point that Mitra made about the diversity of literatures in the Northeast and the diversity of languages. Also, in making the point about the changing landscape, because as political developments and other articulations take shape, or as the generations, newer generations come along, you see a shift, as Shibani has said, from writing in the original or traditional languages to the younger generation moving a lot to writing in English and in Hindi and so on. So if you were to put together today an anthology of classical writers from Assam, you would almost entirely be translating from Assamese. But if you were to do it younger writers, you would have a lot of writing in English and a lot of also forms like poetry and slam poetry and all that kind of thing, and graphic literature, which are also newer forms of thinking and expressing. Also, the Arunachali shift to English, that is also an interesting thing, because Hindi and the imposition of Hindi in Arunachal since the late 60s, I think it was, when it was brought in, has already done away with many of the tribal languages. And now you have an imposition of yet another layer on it, which is interesting to see what that will happen. And I think the new communities that are coming up because of new political articulations, such as queer communities, trans communities, and others in the Northeast who are writing, that actually is a very powerful wave across the different states. It's not limited to one place, I think. So thank you for pointing to all of those things, which will help us to move into our subsequent discussions. The next section of what we are talking about moves into looking at more deeply at the question of diversity and more deeply at the question of communities, that who are these communities of writers, of listeners, of readers that new kinds of literature are addressing. And here we have three speakers. We have Manjeet Baruah, Nitoo Das, and Prachee Dewri, sorry, Prachee. And let me just quickly introduce the speakers to you, and then I'll hand it over to them. So Manjeet teaches at the Special Center for the Study of Northeast India at JNU. His area of research includes literary and cultural history, text and space, and imperial studies. And among his recent works are a book called Hunter, Peasant, Rebel, Colonialism and the British Assam Frontier. His works of translation include Remains of Spring, a Naga village in the no man's land. Then Nitoo is a poet, and where are you, Nitoo? Here you are. A photographer of birds and an educator. She's based in New Delhi. She teaches at Indraprastha College for Women. Her poetry works with voice, with soundscape, and comic defamiliarization in order to explore the strange within the everyday. That's really interesting. She's author of Buki, and then Cyborg Proverbs and Crowbite, and her work has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. Alongside Nitoo's literary practice, she documents birds through photography and illustration and integrates this perspective into her creative and academic work. And Prachee Dewri is Associate Professor of English at Hansraj College. She translates from Assamia and Boro into English. She's translated short stories written by Bhabendranath Saikia, Manorama Das Medhi, Jahirul Hussain, and Ishan Musahari. She has also translated essays by Birdo Singh Crow. Her translations have been published in Sahitya Academy's Indian Literature, Muse India, the Northeast Times, and in an anthology of Asamiya's short stories titled Splendor in the Grass. Thank you very much, and over to all of you in the order in which I've introduced you. So, Manjeet, would you like to go first? And you have, I'm asking each of you to keep it to 8, max 10 minutes. If you
Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity. I'll stick to just a couple of points and possibly around 7, 8 minutes. Uh, basically a researcher. I see myself as a researcher, so whatever I do, including translation, somehow comes within that dimension of being a researcher. The last work which is mentioned in that introduction, I will only speak about that, my experience of translating that novel. It was a novel in Assamese. It was Auliang Orju. It was published in 2007. And I translated that, and it was published in 2016. Now, the novel is set in what was then the time period of the novel is early 1990s, 1993, 1994. That is the time period the novel covers. And it is set in what was then the no man's land between India and Myanmar. That was by and large the Konyak Nagas, the Eastern Nagaland, what is today Eastern Nagaland area. Uh, One of the things which I felt or which I thought when I read the novel is that besides the story itself, besides the fictional dimensions, it also has a lot of ethnographic content, or what I can see as ethnographic content. So I requested the author, is it all right if I do my own bit of research about the place, about the people on which the novel is based? And he said he'd be very happy if I do that. So I did my own little bit of study, and I also cross-checked. This study is mainly in terms of customs, rituals, and so on, which is there. And I also consulted some of my, let's say, Konyak friends, and to check whether my understanding is correct or not. And that is one that, in fact, then comes into the translation as well, because some of the things I had to request the author if it can be actually presented in a more correct way, and he said he's actually happy if that can be done. Another thing which I had to do was in terms of names of place, names of people, and so on. We are dealing with the author, by the way. He wrote the novel based on his own personal experience. He was there. It's not that it's a fantasy. He was there. So, in terms of language, the language one is dealing with in that region or in that area is what we would call Tibeto-Burman language. And Assamese happens to be an Indo-Aryan language. So, patterns of sound begins to shift. So that is also something which I had to cross-check, and in the English translation, possibly one can say it is closer to the sound of the place and the people that the novel is dealing with. That is another thing which, as a researcher, I worked out. And then a couple of things, of course, as a translator, it was pointed out in the previous section as well. Uh, um, I mean, not translating certain words, but not leaving it not leaving it unexplained. One adds a sentence here and there without the footnotes, of course, adding a sentence here and there to explain what these words are. The reason for retaining some of these words were actually, for example, words like, from what I remember, sakan or kalap and so on, is that they are not merely words of common usage. These words also carry a certain political meanings or political messaging, even though sakan would mean weight, load, basically, or kalap would be tea and so on. But the way these words occur in the narrative also carries certain political meanings. Therefore, I felt it was important to retain these words, but I give any explanation. At the end of it, of course, I also provided a glossary because I felt it is important to have a glossary at the end, what many of these terms which are there in the text means. Besides that, all of this, by the way, all this, let's say, quote unquote, this is all part of translator's visibility in a sense. So all of this is acknowledged by the author in his preface to the translation. And to that translation, I also add as a translator's preface, where I talk about what I have done and so on. And I also add an introduction, which is an academic bit of writing. And there's a glossary. So when we take all of that into account, eventually the translated book, as it comes out from the publisher, it is not a replica of the Assamese. It is something. It carries certain things, but it also changes certain things in the process. And I went with it. I did that because, as I said, I mainly see myself as a researcher, and that somehow comes into the work, whatever work I do. In the course of doing all that, I also realized that this whole idea, there's one of the ideas which was doing the rounds even while we were studying, is this idea of resistance translation. Certain things don't get translated, should not be translated, resist, and so on. And I realized that if the objective, if the intent is to communicate not just the story, but communicate the text. I mean, text and story are not exactly the same things. So if the intent or the purpose is to communicate the text, then this idea of one has to begin with the assumption that it is always possible to communicate. And I feel that, actually, this ideas of resistant translation and all, I feel comes from another idea, like alternative reason and so on, in which I wrote. I never had really much of faith, alternative reason. A reason is reason, ultimately, and it is always possible to understand each other, to comprehend each other. And there's enough works which, primary writings, which actually reflects that possibility of comprehension and communication. If we choose not to understand, that's a different matter. So that is another dimension which I sort of understood, or which I realized. All of these matters actually comes into play because we are dealing with, or what I felt, we're dealing with a case of, say, something like for the lack of a better word, I'm saying, Sir had mentioned in the morning actually, some kind of a double translation, because the author, when he's writing in Assamese, he is actually writing about a context which is not exactly the context in which he is growing up or socializing and so on. It's a different context in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, linguistic family, and so on and so forth. So the author is already actually translating certain things into the Assamese language. And then when I began my research and did all that, it's also another level of say, translation which is taking place, So in that sense, that Auliang the Assamese novel is not something like quote unquote a pure sense of a novel anyway. So all of this is what I wanted to just briefly share about my experience of translating this novel. Now, why this novel is important, actually significant, is that in 2007, when this novel was published in Assamese, I may be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, it possibly was a first novel in the genre of novel. It was a first novel, work of fiction, on that area that it is covering. I think Naga writings had not really covered that area. It was more on the other side. So in that sense, it's a first of its kind, the novel. And when I did the translation, it came out in 2016. I think even in 2016, today it may have changed, but in 2016, possibly it was also one of the early, I should say, works in fiction in English language, which is on that region, on the people. So just wanted to share this experience of translating this work, and that is all I have to share. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Manjeet. Thank you for adding what I think is a really important dimension to even this morning's discussion, the approaching the translation or work of translation as a researcher. So expanding the horizon and going into the background research. Some people referred to that in the morning also in a different way. And also for pointing to the need to communicate and really the desire to understand, which are the two things that come together in the reception, in the doing of a translation and its acceptance or reading. So thank you for pointing to that, and several other points. We'll come back to those in the discussion at the end. So I will turn now to Nitoo. Nitoo, you are the second person on this panel. I've already introduced you, so hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, organizers, the book review, Chandrachari, Urvashi, and Shibani, for having me here today. My paper today is slightly dry and academic. I felt I needed to do this primarily because I wanted to read from a written text, and also so that I don't ramble and I keep within the time frame. So I'm going to start now. To discuss translation in the Northeast, as Urvashi has already stated, we obviously have to start with the contested term Northeast itself. However, since the term's colonial origins, post-colonial continuities, and the way it flattens diverse communities is already widely acknowledged in scholarship and public discourse, And given the paucity of time, of course, I'll not be engaging with it today, but we have to remember that it is at the back of my mind and constructs the foundation of this paper. And again, as already pointed out by both Urvashi and Shibani, translation in Northeast India is a strategic gesture shaped by the extraordinary multiplicity of languages and cultures in the region. With innumerable languages spoken across its states, translation seems like it's totally necessary, and also, of course, it's also a challenge. It is not only interlingual but also intercultural, since oral traditions, folklore, and indigenous epistemologies resist easy transfer into dominant languages. Lexical gaps, the tension between orality and literacy, the embeddedness of cultural practices make translation a very fraught process. Rituals, kinship terms, ecological references, oral rhythms often lose their resonance when moved into English or Hindi, and yet these translations are seen as essential for exposure and cultural exchange, which was discussed in the previous panel as well. Translation theory has long grappled with the tension between domestication and foreignization. Early translation theorists like Schleiermacher argued that translators must either move the reader toward the writer or the writer toward the reader, while Venuti emphasized that domestication adapts text to target language norms, erasing cultural specificity, whereas foreignization retains traces of the source language foregrounding difference. In the Northeast, I guess, we have to see how foreignness or foreignization works. Translating Assamese, Bodo, or Khasi texts into English without erasing the cultural markers may be interpreted as a political act. Writers such as Indra Goswami and Aruni Kashyap exemplify how traces of Assamese identity remain legible even in their English language texts, embodying translingualism and hybridity. Their work demonstrates that translation is not simply a matter of linguistic transfer, but of cultural negotiation. Chantal Jabu's metaphor of the palimpsest can also be applied to such writings where indigenous languages leave visible traces within English or Hindi or other dominant language texts. Writers often embed words, idioms, rhythms, signaling the persistence of cultural identity just living beneath the dominant script. These borrowings act like remnants of an earlier writing that resist erasure, much as following Zabu, African languages do in her analysis. In translation, preserving such traces highlights the layered presence of local voices rather than allowing them to be fully absorbed into a homogenizing national or global language. Post-colonial translation studies remind us that neutrality is impossible. Maria Timochko argues that all facets of translation, from text choice to strategy to publication, are connected to ideology. Timochko distinguishes between metaphoric and metonymic views of translation. The metaphoric views, which we also discussed without using these terms, of course, in the previous panel, says translation as substitution, replacing words in one language with equivalence of the other. The metonymic view, by contrast, understands translation as partial, contextual, and relational. Translation is always partial, foregrounding some aspects of the source while leaving others out. It is contextual, shaped by the translator's identity, the publishing house's priorities, the politics of presence in the target culture. It is relational also, standing in relationship not only to its source text, but also to other texts in the target culture, to regional literary networks, and to the broader politics of representation. In Northeast India, this metonymic perspective is especially useful since translations are inevitably partial readings shaped by ideology, forcing us to pose questions like who will be translated and who will be left behind. The layering of translation choices in Northeast India illustrate this point. Examples from the region demonstrate this dynamics. Indra Goswami's works are frequently translated, and she may be considered a canonical writer who embodies what we may think of as Assamese-ness. A significant writer like Arupa Patangya Kolita, who has questioned certain elements of the bourgeois Assamese identity, like the depiction of the Assam agitation in novels like The Story of Felani, which was also published by Zuban, or even Rita Chaudhary, who translates a lot of her work herself, have been translated into English. At the same time, writers like Monica Devi remain largely untranslated, showcasing the erasure of certain voices in the literary marketplace. Translation choices are metonymic acts that privilege some identities while silencing others. Devi started publishing her work in 2005 with Priyo Alap, followed by Hokioti in 2007, Moidama Junaki in 2008, and since then she has published extensively several more short story collections Boitorani, Burhatwe Kole, Johor Mohor, etc. For the last collection, she in fact won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2014. Davis' prolific output and recognition through the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar has not really been this has not really translated into wider dissemination beyond Assam. Similarly, short story writer Jayanta Saikia's contribution remains confined to regional readerships. In fact, I translated one of Jayanta Hoikia's short stories a long time ago, and it was a very interesting experience for me, similar to what Manjeet has also talked about, how to look at certain ideas of identity as it's shown, almost ethnographic identity as it is shown in the original. The marginal acknowledgement of writers like Monica Debi and Jointa Hoikia exemplifies center-periphery dynamics that post-colonial translation theory has long interrogated. Translation, far from being an unbiased conduit, operates as a metonymic act that advertises certain voices while rendering others invisible, thereby reproducing hierarchies of signification. Their relative obscurity contrasts sharply with other writers whose extensive translation into English facilitated entry into national and global literary markets. This disparity underscores how translation choices in the Northeast are shaped by cultural politics. The privileged writers who can be assimilated into dominant literary narratives, perhaps, while silencing those whose work resists or complicates such assimilation. In this sense, the comparative invisibility of Monica Debi or Jointa Hoikia is not accidental, but symptomatic of the broader post-colonial condition where the politics of translation perpetuate uneven geographies of literary recognition. Market forces and institutional priorities reinforce these hierarchies. Obviously, like who gets read, who gets included in the syllabus, etc. Privileging languages with larger readerships and silencing others. Arguably, the consequences are significant. Some literatures gain substantial appreciation while others remain unseen. There is, of course, the risk of cultural erasure of these marginal languages. And of course, there is also the power dynamics between majority and minority communities in the Northeast. The metonymic methodology that I referred to earlier helps explain the structural inequalities, showing that translation is not just about text but about institutional and ideological networks. The repeated translation of Assamese writers may prove this point. For example, we may, to take this discussion further, it's an obvious statement to make. Assamese writers are far more likely to be frequently translated into English than, say, Boro or Kabi writers. The role of English in this region in some ways complicates matters further. In many northeastern states, English is already the first language, and many of the writers write directly in English, publish directly in English. And may also raise questions about whether English is entirely necessary or whether it perpetuates other kinds of colonial systems. Decolonial perspectives suggest that translation should not only move toward English but also between indigenous languages. So we can have Boro text translated into Khasi or Mizo text into Assamese, etc., and can perhaps foster more regional dialogue and a kind of amorphous understanding of solidarity, perhaps. Decolonial translation also emphasizes reciprocity, multiplicity, and the preservation of indigenous epistemology. It would also be interesting to see how something like the very subversive Mia poetry movement, which some of us may be aware of, and some of us may have been associated with the movement, and how it could be incorporated into larger questions of translation from the region. Decolonial translation in Northeast India, therefore, must be theorized as a practice that interrogates asymmetries of accessibility and distribution by promoting the persistence of cultural traces, fostering inter-indigenous networks of exchange, and acknowledging the translator's positionality. Translation can be understood not as neutral substitution, but as a relational act embedded in power. Such a model reorients translation from a tool of assimilation toward the critical mode of representation that sustains linguistic diversity and challenges dominant literary economies. To conclude, the dynamics of translation in Northeast India reveal how linguistic practice is shaped by institutional and cultural frameworks. And according to the system of translation that I referred to earlier of partiality and relationality, which foregrounds, we've seen that certain voices are foregrounded and amplified while others remain obscured. So a critical decolonial approach therefore requires that translation be mobilized, not merely as a tool of circulation, but an intervention into questions of equity and visibility. And this is not really in my paper, but this is something that I wanted to add, that when we talk about, because there was a question of untranslatability in the previous panel, and I think that when we talk about the Northeast and translation, the question of untranslatability comes across quite often. And to this, I would perhaps like to add that it's not about, the question is not about not translating, but about having a multiplicity of translations, which I would say that, is the decolonial way of looking at the question of translation itself. So thank you. Yes.
Nitoo, thank you for that very, very rich presentation. There's a lot in it, and I will not even try to go into it, but I want to particularly thank you for bringing our attention to translation not being an act in itself devoid of politics and hierarchy, but also being something. This is an active intervention into questions of equity and visibility, which is the note on which you ended, and which ran through your whole presentation in the ways in which you addressed forgotten languages and some languages which dominate the translation and so on. I'm just wondering whether in this forum, when we come to the discussions, we can actually maybe start to think about what we can do to I don't know whether it's publishers or as readers, but is this a case for, within quote, state intervention to put, let's say, finance, if you like, or to put active, some kind of active intervention, say in the kind of model that the Tamil Nadu government is following on encouraging translations? Is this something that we can learn from? Because how can this business of marginalizing certain writers and ensuring that only certain voices are heard in the act of translating, who can address this? How can it be dealt with? It's not only a question of publishers' choices. It is a question of a much larger system of acceptance, non-acceptance, etc., all of those things. Just wondering whether we can use this forum or similar discussions to think through that. Maybe an interesting thing to do. Okay, so we will turn now to our last speaker, Prachee Dewri. Prachee, I've already introduced you, so please go ahead with your presentation.
Uh, 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 Everybody has already drawn attention to the linguistic diversity of the northeastern region, and I would focus more on the linguistic diversity within Assam and focus on one author, Bishnu Prasad Rabha, and how he negotiated that linguistic diversity. Before that, I would kind of lay out uh, the way this diversity features and the language ecology of the region in terms of so there are multiple tribes, and you also have the Okhomia language, which is dominant, right? And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the dwindling languages, which are some of them are disappearing, and as you pointed out, the inequality between which languages get translated and which languages don't. Apart from that, within those languages, for instance, I'll point out in the Deuri community as well as other communities like the Rabha community, there are the dwindling number of speakers is it's can be according to region, can be according to clan. For instance, the Deuris who travel from Arunachal Pradesh, Sadia towards the south, the ones who settled north of the Brahmaputra, they retain the language, and those who traveled to the south of the Brahmaputra have lost the language. And so one clan, that is the Dibonga clan, which remained in the north, knows the language, and the two clans which crossed the Brahmaputra, the Tengapunya and Borgia, they don't know the language. So there is already, you could say, bilingualism already there, and the languages, the Ohomia that they speak is also quite different in the sense that it has elements of the Deuri language as well. Similarly, with the Rabha tribe as well, there is the Pati Rabha clan, which has completely lost the language. And right now, there is a revivalism that's happening among communities where there is an attempt to relearn the language. And so the role of translation in that is great in the sense that so translations are happening not just from, I mean, right from the minority language into English, but also minority language into Ohomia. And a lot of these communities, like the Deuri community, has many Jangpai and various journals which are bilingual journals. So they are in a constant state of translation. And another interesting thing I'd like to point out is that translation in orality also you would see, in the sense that the same for songs which are sung in the Deuri language north of the Brahmaputra are sung in Ohomia in the south of the Brahmaputra. So somewhere in the process of migration, a translation also happened in that. And right now in the present day, there are not too much translation right now. I'm just talking about what probably needs to happen. That not only is translation one way um, uh, of uh, of uh, getting larger viewership for a particular form of literature, but it also is a way of forming identity within the community, as it's only through translation that a major part of one community would get to know about their own culture, because it's getting lost in the process. So I'm right now focusing on translation from with from, as I said, not into English but into Ohomia, and from Ohomia into the tribal language. And so for my right now I'll focus on one person, Bishnu Prasad Rabha, who was an artist and polyglot. He said that he knew a lot of languages, but he mainly wrote in Ohomia and wrote a little bit in Bodo. Right, he belonged to the Bodo community, and and so he wrote a lot of a few short stories in Bodo, and those are also available in Ohomia translation, his own translation. And he also because he was a revolutionary who was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and so he was involved in mobilizing peasants for the peasant movement of the 1940s and early 1950s, and he was seen as a valuable leader because he could speak in two of the major languages of the region, Ohomia and Bodo. And so he also composed a lot of songs which he would sing alternately, Ohomia and Bodo. So there's one song, Sadhin Sitya Halua, which is has alternate lines of Bodo and Ohomia, right? And then there is one story called Punka, which is about a couple from the Bodo community who are about to lose their land. So it is a story about landless peasants in the 1940s in Assam, and it is a story about a story that he had encountered during his years when he was involved in the peasant struggle. And so and he he chose to write it also, translate it also into Ohomia, so that it is so known to the wider population of Assam. So he could be seen as somebody who helped to bridge the gap between the various linguistic communities through his bilingualism. And another thing, in his translations and also in his speeches, sometimes one is, even when he wrote and spoke in Ohomia, Bodo is a tonal language. So there is a musicality to it. As Tilotama Mishra has pointed out, that uh, um, how uh, writers from non Ohomia speaking communities, when they write in Ohomia, they write an Ohomia that's imbued with the flavor of their own language, which is what Vishnu Prasad Rabha as well he did. And so there is the tonality comes, there is a lot of alliteration, there's a lot of repetition which he uses in order, probably the lack of tonality in Ohomia, he has to replace it with a certain kind of musicality. And there has been talk about whether you should translate certain words or not. And the way he managed to negotiate this is that he would use both the words. For instance, gogona is a Jew's harp. It's called gogona in Ohomia, but it's actually called gongona in Bodo. And he could have easily just written gogona because everybody would understand. But when he writes, he says gongona gogona. And sometimes he says sipung is a flute in Bodo, and he chooses to say sipung bahi. So there he brings in the variety. Even if it's a similar sounding word, he chooses to include it. And I think it's also because more than a writer, he was a orator. So in speaking, you can't have footnotes. So you have to incorporate what you have. So that orality comes into the way he writes as well. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prachee, for that really lovely paper and going deep into the work. I think, one of the things that I took away from your paper, apart from the specifics of the writer you're speaking about, is the constant state of translation between languages that you were talking about. And the link that you make, which Nitoo was also making when she spoke of Mia poetry, about translation and migration, and translation as a way of retaining a history, recalling a history, and how it varies between, even as close as the one end of the one side of the Brahmaputra to the other side of the Brahmaputra, and translation as heritage. I think that's another thing that you brought out very well. So thank you very much. We'll hold these in our heads, move on to the next slot. I'm sorry I confused you a bit by saying the last speaker. That was the last speaker in the subsection that we were looking at, which was looking at community, diversity, and translation. We are about halfway through our list of speakers. So we have 10 speakers, and we've had 5 speakers speak so far. Shibani is going to take over from here. So Shibani, over to you.
So when we talk about lost and found in translation, with reference to the Northeast, it's not just cultural nuance that we are talking about. We are talking about loss of entire languages, dialects, communities, ethnicities, and I think this is what the next segment is going to touch upon. The dark side of the partition and translation, because when we talk about the partition, inevitably we think it is just the partition of the Northwest frontier. Increasingly, one is recognizing that Bengal was equally impacted, but I think the Northeast and the impact of the partition of the Northeast is something that is still not found space in this discourse. So Debjani is going to talk more about that. Debjani Sengupta is the author of The Partition of Bengal, Fragile Borders and New Identities, and has edited Mapmaking, Partition Stories from Two Bengals, and a collection of short stories by Jhumur Pandey titled Deceit Brought Us to Assam. She teaches at IP College, Delhi University. Deceit Brought Us to Assam is actually a translation of a song sung by tea garden laborers. So I think over to you, Debjani.
So, happily thinking I'll come at the end. So, but it's all right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chandra, for inviting me, Shibani and Urvashi. I'm going to read because then I will stick to time, and because I'm going to talk a little bit about the partition because that is a historical background I need to fill in a little bit. But I will also specifically talk about the Barak Valley here and a writer from the Barak Valley whom I have had the privilege to translate very recently. So, as Shibani mentions, partition studies have now come to slowly grapple with new localities and geographies, apart from Punjab and Bengal, that had so informed the field. Partition narratives from the northeastern states of India, particularly Assam and Tripura, have come from different disparate locations and different languages and deal with a modern post-colonial state. The fundamental problem, of course, everybody has already touched upon it. The fundamental problem of studying the Northeast in partition studies is, of course, the issue of language and belonging. The complexities of studying this region through any singular lens is therefore highly problematic. We sometimes don't remember that Assam was partitioned through the Sylhet referendum, July 6th, 7th, 1947. And the poll was whether the region should merge with East Pakistan. The Sylhet referendum opened up the fate of Kachar, whose inhabitants, both Hindus and Muslims, were unwilling to go to Pakistan. When partition occurred, a large part of the region, except the 4 thanas, which stayed in Assam, were allotted to East Pakistan. The Indian part is now called the Barak River Valley today. Although the Sylhetis, and I'm talking mainly of the group Sylhetis, who speak Sylheti but write in Bangla. And here Bangla is not as the power language. It's a very interesting kind of relationship that they have. Although Sylhetis never faced communal violence in the way that we are familiar with in the rest of partition studies, the sense of the loss of their original homeland and the subsequent political and economic insecurity in their new homeland, Assam, resulted in trauma and a certain kind of homelessness and exile that has not been really investigated. The politics of language, the imposition of the state language Assamese on the Bangla speakers of the Barak Valley, the aspirations of the indigenous people and the migrant labor populations in the tea gardens have complicated the existence of the socio-political dynamics in the region. The identity question in the Barak Valley have been framed not as a rivalry against Muslims, but in opposition to Assamese linguistic hegemony, and has often resulted in a kind of defensive linguistic subnationalism. Unlike the Bengali-speaking Muslims of the Brahmaputra Valley, who have often declared Assamese as their mother tongue, the Bengali Hindus and Muslims in the Barak Valley have resisted a kind of linguistic assimilation. Speaking Sylheti but writing in Bangla, the writers of this region continue to shape a very distinct ethno-linguistic culture that is marked by a double complexity of relationship with both Assamese and Bangla. Distanced from the metropolitan publishers of Kolkata and facing Assamese identity politics, they constantly negotiate their distinct experiences through narratives that uphold the importance of memory, of exile, and a sense of homelessness. The languages of the tea garden workers, a mixture of Shautali, Hindi, Bengali, Assamese, continue to influence their writings, as do Manipuri, Rongmei Naga, and the Dimasa Kachari tongues. Consequently, the negotiations of multiple and varied linguistic registers create very deeply complex narratives that foreground, as I'd already mentioned, issues of home and homelessness and exile. I want to just briefly give you an example from a writer from the region so that, you know, whatever I have said can be underlined a little bit better. I'm talking about a writer called Jhumur Pandey who uses Bangla, but her Bangla is very interesting because she's constantly uh, um, uh, uh, inserting within the Bangla narrative, constantly inserting Sylheti and Sadri, the Bagania Bhasha, the language of the tea garden workers. So her Bangla is also a very fluid space, a strategic, as Nitoo has said, a strategy of almost a kind of internal translation. One of her short stories, Mokkhoda Sundarir Harano Prapti, is a very luminescent memory text with very interesting lyrical qualities that opens with a wedding song in Sylheti, Chalor Talai Jhamur Jhumur, Kolar Talai Bia. And she refuses to translate it into Bangla. So she just leaves it at that as a kind of linguistic flagging. And this is, of course, also to showcase that this is an intricate act of remembrance for the protagonist who has left her village and through the partition have come and settled in a Meherpur camp where she now lives as a refugee. And I'm quoting, this is my English translation, the word itself, the word partition, is itself enough to break and grind every ounce of bone and flesh in Mokkhoda's body. The small word was enough to uproot her home, family, existence, and environment. Yet all roots cannot be pulled out. Transformed into thorns, shaped by pain, so many roots have survived. Trees don't live without roots, neither did Mokkhoda. Pandey's story deploys a slew of narrative strategies to represent Mokkhoda's loss of status and a present impoverishment, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of the spaces she moves through. So the story flags not only these movements by inserting folk songs in the Sylheti language in the text, but also through the spaces and the wedding songs that she remembers, but also through the Sylheti language itself. Manusher mon re partition dia bandha jayni go. And this is a refrain that comes through the story again and again. So Pandey's story is of a particular interesting historical significance because it is, in a sense, teleologically reinscribing the short story of a people back into the canonical Bangla partition stories. And she is reinscribing the narrative as a kind of linguistic flagging. The language of the Sylheti people, now swamped under the mainstream power languages of Assamese and Bangla, but which remains redolent with a sense of anguish because the very act of articulation is an act of remembrance of a culture and a homeland and a way of life that has now vanished forever. Thank you so much.
I think we've spoken about how a lot of any act of translation is a political act, but I think what was just said and only makes it even more evident that given the kind of the stories about refugees, those impacted by the Sylhet referendum, those stories have been in existence in Assamese and other languages from the Northeast for a very long time. The fact that they are now attracting translators and translations are being done into English during a time period when the political climate chooses to attack people of a particular identity. I think that is very, very interesting to note, that while their identity is being questioned, their being Assami or Homia is being questioned, they are in translation seem to be writing back and questioning that. I talked about narrativizing history, which is a predominant trope that one notices in writing from the Northeast, as well as what translations choose to pick out. And I think it's interesting that the very title of this collection of short stories references a history which is completely effaced, which is that of the tea garden laborers brought to work during British colonialism, when tea was discovered, and and they did not have sufficient number of manpower, and the conditions in which they were brought to Assam. So I think translation of this community does a lot more in terms of not just bringing across stories, but bringing across histories have been effaced so far. So thank you for that. We move on to the next segment, which is on compiling orality and absence in the translation of oral narratives, a case from Northeast India. Dr. Kharigpham will be talking about that. He teaches in the Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia. In addition to teaching literature, he is actively engaged in the promotion and development of tribal languages. He writes poetry in Tangkhul, his mother tongue, as well as in English. Over to you.
Thank you. Book review, Ma'am Chandra. And thank you, Shibani, for giving me this opportunity. I think I'm going back a little backward, because before I start talking about compilation and translation, because translation for all of us, for many of us, except me or some few people here, it's not a natural act actually, but for you, because we are used to hearing translation or living with translation. The act of, so even though my title is titled Northeast, I will be confining my experience to a very small group of people called the Tangkhul Naga tribes of Manipur. For us, translation started with a disaster. 2 years after the Presbyterian missionaries arrived in Mizoram to evangelize the Mizos, the Baptist missionaries, the American Baptist missionaries arrived in Ukhrul in 1896 to, of course, teach, and then civilize and to evangelize. It was here that the missionary, Reverend William Pettigrew, in fact, started churning out religious literature. And by 1918, he had successfully actually published a huge dictionary called the Tangkhul Naga Dictionary. This is where I want to start. And in this dictionary was not just a book that actually explains words, but in fact, he added, and he decided to be a Prospero, right? And thus, and because he was just 21 years old, mind you, this man who has crossed oceans was just 21 years old. And then his wife was even younger. So one day, as the wife was collecting Alice Pettigrew, she came back swollen, her hands, and all swollen. And then Pettigrew, a 21-year-old, very romantic person, as we can understand, was shocked to see that his wife, has been hurt. So the first thing that he asked his Alice was, "What happened?" And they say, there's a so the lady, young wife, pointed towards the jungle and said, "There's a poisonous grass." Okay, so Pettigrew went and saw the grass, and he didn't like the grass at all because it has hurt his wife, young wife, and he said, "From this henceforth, you don't exist." It became nameless. The grass name was, it used to be called Chippy. And therefore Pettigrew was so angry that he converted Chippy, he translated rather Chippy as the devil in the Tangkhul language in his dictionary. One. The second act of translation was then he came up with the book of John, where without realizing the social context of the Tangkhuls, he realized, because the Tangkhuls were in fact following an angelless religion, where the traditional Tangkhul Naga religion have no angels, and because there is no angel, we don't have the devil also. Okay, so our gods were neither bad nor good. Okay, but they were loving enough, or they were mischievous enough. And so, but the social setup of the Tangkhul Naga was that they hate slavery. A Tangkhul mother would prefer her son killed than be a slave of somebody. And then, but without knowing the social context, again, William Pettigrew in the book of John invented Kazing Rao. Now, Kazing means sky. In Rao means again slave, which which the Tangkhuls could not comprehend. The reason why God, a benevolent Christian God, should have a slave, would have a slave up there in the sky. Okay. So this is one of a short journey. The first phase of the Tangkhuls' interaction with translation. Now, so when Pettigrew came to the Okrul to missionarize in 1896, he found out that there were two very interesting characters, singers rather. Now we call them folk singers. And so they were competing. They were very competitive. They sang so well. And when he sat with them, the other man, one of them agreed to actually come to listen to his preaching, and but the other guy refused to attend Pettigrew's school. After 3 years, of course, obviously, as expected, the man who attended Pettigrew's school became Christians. And then in 1918, he came up with his own collection of poetry, which became the birth of the Tangkhul literature for us, which is, so in 1918. And yet the man who refused to let his song be actually reduced to written form resist till he died in 1932. While dying, he in fact instructed his son that his songs should never be printed or written down, because this man has actually composed so many songs, so many beautiful songs. But so his son, till 1950, till he lived, he actually kept the word of never actually coming out with say into books, right? So the father's song was never published. But after he died, the grandson decided to actually, because he himself was a Christian and then he himself was educated in Jorhat, that he came back and said, like, it has to be, written down. It has to be compiled, And so in 1950, the young man, educated young man, he actually collected all the poems, all the songs actually, and then published it. it so happened that historically, it so happened that in 1952, the Tangkhul Literature Society decided to translate and compiled some of the most important works of the Tangkhul writers. And but ironically, or not surprisingly, ironical but not surprisingly, Ramray, the poet who died, his works and his name was never mentioned or in the collection, in the right. So some of the writers or young writers questioned the wisdom of the literature society, and the simple answer to why it was not mentioned, why it was not his songs or works were not mentioned, was that the that the publication date of Mr. Ramray does not merit him into including in the anthology. Okay, meaning that it had been published just 2 years old, and therefore it cannot be a classical thing, right? So, so this is where I am. I am now touching into translation and the politics of compilation. My paper. Yet before I go into that, I think I have spoken for more than. Yeah. Yeah. So for those of us now, for those of us, because for many of us, translation comes naturally, almost naturally. Yet for many of us, in fact, not just translation, but the very act of writing down our thoughts is not natural, are not natural. For us, the picture, traditionally, the picture of a man or a woman writing is a picture of solitude, or it's a picture of, one person, right? It's a very intimate act. And yet, for those of us who carries our memories, stories in our body, to write down my existential experience with a tool on a page is a very different experience, which takes away the intimacy, the privilege of my intimate privilege with myself. Having said that, then to write is also to uproot. Now comes the translation, because now translation is not just about transferring knowledge; it's about transplanting. Therefore, it disturbs, because the very fact for a tribal who have just come out of who have been just pushed into written tradition. Now you can imagine translation is a second uprootation. And yet, likewise, but strangely, that though as the story that I narrated, just pointed out, that compilation, like like translation, it is an extended act of distortion, uprootation, and hierarchicalization, right? When a text is lifted from its original text and placed within a compilation, it is uprooted from the discursive, historical, and material conditions that shaped its meaning. What once functioned as an autonomous utterance becomes reframed as a fragment. Its voice subtly redirected by the compiler's curatorial logic. Lastly, crucially, compilation is bound to canonization. Now, here, as the story is as it happened, an important work was simply dismissed, simply because it was just published yesterday, and that it cannot be clubbed with another thing. So, thereby, then compilation is, there is never a neutral act. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kharigpham, for giving us a historical overview of translating works from the Tangkhul region, but also, for providing us with an experience of translating as well as compiling And in many ways, I think your talk summed up the very title of the panel, Lost and Found in Translation. So thank you for that. I'm not going to take up much time because I think we are a little short on time by now, I think. So we will move on to the next one, which continues with orality in many ways. So there is some kind of continuity. We have translating orality, and the two panelists on this are Nzanmongi Patton and Achingliu Kamei. Patton is an associate professor in the Department of English, Gargi College, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest range from oral literature and history, folklore studies, translation, Indian writings in English, Naga writings, etc. She is the author of A Girl Swallowed by a Tree, Lotha Naga Tales, Retold. It was shortlisted for the Gordon Graham Award for Naga Literature in 2021 in the non-fiction category. Her latest book is a children's novelette titled The Adventures of Little Zeno. Dr. Achingliu Kamei is an associate professor at the University of Delhi, author and ultra runner. Her areas of interest are English literature from the Northeast, African American women's writing, and translations of oral literature. Two of her poems were selected for the NEP 2020 English syllabus of Jamia Millia Islamia, and her book Songs of Rongdailu was chosen for study at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, USA. She has given several invited lectures, poetry readings, etc. She has mentored writers under the PM Young Writers Program and is working on her next book. She has several volumes of poetry, by the way, on her next book for children titled Adventure with Grandma, Where the Mountain Meets the Waterfall. I'm not going to say much about the panel because I think many of us have spoken about orality and the importance of orality in the Northeast. Therefore, who's going to go first? Sorry. Okay, Nzanmongi Patton.
Okay, since we are close to 1 now, let me start with a good afternoon. So it has been a lovely morning and noon, I think, well spent, hearing and, learning from a lot of theorists as well as practitioners of translation. And before I make a fool of myself, let me just confess that till this morning, as per the brief that I had received, I had prepared a rather, modest theoretical and historical perspective on translation. But in the morning, as I was listening to the four panelists, I was very inspired to chuck, whatever I had prepared and to now talk from the perspective of a practitioner, as somebody who is actively translating. So forgive me if I ramble. I will try to stick to the brief. I hope that the gods of orality are with me as I walk you guys through my experience, the little bit of experience that I have had as a translator. And more for myself, I think not so much for you all, but for myself, I'd like to divide, my presentation into 4 parts. I'll start with my introduction. Chandra was just asking me what my name means, and she also requested me, why don't you start with that? So I can't let down the host. So I will start, in fact, with an introduction to my name, and then, talk a little bit about oral tradition and what I grew up with, move on to some of the questions that Urvashi had thrown to the panelists in the morning. In fact, because of those questions, I was inspired to actually, look into my heart and speak from my heart. But I was a little disappointed that you did not, pull out those questions. But I'm going to be the renegade. I'm going to go back and revisit those questions. And finally, I'd also like to do, sorry? Yes. And finally, I'm going to read out a short, excerpt from my book, Girl Swallowed by a Tree. So, yes, my name is Nzanmongi Patton. It's from the Lotha Naga dialect. I'm one of the Naga tribes inhabiting Nagaland, 17 tribes officially, of course, unofficially, many more, as many of the speakers have spoken in the Northeast. So Nagaland itself has 17 official languages. I'm a Lotha Naga. And one of the things, so the meaning of my name, yes. So Nzanmongi, Nzan in my dialect means love. And Mongi means somebody who has been very loved.
And there is, of course, a story and an etymology behind it also, more than this, because my mom and dad, they had a love marriage. They eloped. So the child, which is born out of a lot of love, they decided to call Nzanmongi, and that is where my name comes from. Also, for those of you who are familiar with Naga tribes, you know that there are certain things which are associated with us, like food, right? Cuisine. Now it has become a buzzword, and food has become very local. So Lotha Nagas, we are known for our bamboo shoot. And I'm mentioning this because later in my reading, I am also going to come back to bamboo shoot. Okay, secondly, now, growing up for me in Nagaland and in the space that I grew up in, the lines between lived reality and, like a lived physical, tangible living and the supernatural were pretty much blurred. We have heard of a lot of speakers talking about researching, and theory, of course, theoretical interventions are very important. But the cycle says that the lived reality and the practice is also very important in continuing the research work. So coming to, like how I grew up, I come from, I think for a lot of Nagas, we are fed very richly on oral stories, of course. So my childhood was no different. Even till date, by the way, we have these, men called Motze Eris. Motze Eri, in other words, loosely translated, is a storyteller. And by the way, unlike with a lot of storytellers across, like different spaces and cultures, in my tribe, in the Lotha Naga tribe, storytellers are mostly men. And apparently, it's not just any random, like gentlemen or random men, but also men who either are not married or men who are married but they do not have children, because the whole task and act of telling stories was taken as a very serious responsibility. And of course also this whole belief in the fact that as you tell stories, the unseen forces also come and disturb you, and therefore in order to not endanger the children of parents or fathers who have children, they would either be the bachelors or men who do not have any children. So I grew up like that. Also, I grew up hearing stories of, I remember this as a young child, my parents talking about a certain individual. His name was Ntungo, I still remember. He died because his sonho, loosely translated, sonho is like your spirit animal. So his spirit animal was in a tiger, and of course, in those days, hunting was very rampant. So Ntungo's sonho was in a tiger, and a hunter had killed that tiger. And therefore, Ntungo was sitting at home, just with his usual mundanes and all, but he drops dead, right? Yeah. And therefore, I also grew up hearing about Sonyos. Or I also heard about the famous Ramo of Bhandari. Ramo, loosely translated, is a tree monster. And the story behind the Ramo is that when you see a Ramo, when this is usually, of course, when you go to the jungle and all, when you see a Ramo, you're supposed to look at the Ramon top down from the head, not from the feet. Because if you look at the Ramo from the feet, the Ramo grows and elongates itself and becomes very tall. Whereas if you look top down from the head, then it becomes short. Yes. Then I also grew up hearing about stories of how certain gentlemen, when they had gone to Assam, of course, this is for my grandparents' age, but they retold these stories to me, how certain gentlemen, when they went to Assam, to, butter, salt, and, sesame seeds. Those were the usual exchanges between, I think, my tribesmen and the, people in Assam. So, one of these gentlemen, he disappears for a very long time. He is, nowhere to be found. All the friends are asked where he is. Nobody knows. Many days later, this man comes back and he says that I was whisked away by the Longkomers. Longkomers, loosely translated again, not a very, a faithful and loyal translation, but dwarfs. Those, a mythic dwarf. So he was whisked away by the Longkomers. And so, he comes back many days later, disoriented also, and, not able to remember the full stories, but then bits and pieces of his experiences with the Longkomers. So after having grown up with so much of these kind of stories, or about the Etchali, Etchali, by the way, loosely translated, is the land of the dead. And I remember as a young child when I used to, go to Wokha with my parents, we used to cross a mountain range, and every time, my parents would point and say, that's Etchali, the land or where, the dead go, right? Yeah, so the land of the Etchali. So these were all the stories that I grew up, like a hearing and feasting on. But to go back to one of the questions that Urvashi had asked in the morning, when did you start translating and why do you translate? I think it, like despite having grown on such a very heavy diet on rich storytelling, it was when I entered the classroom of Delhi University as a teacher and teaching a text like Homer's Iliad that it struck me. I know so much about the Greeks or the weaving culture, women and weaving, kind of synonymous, right? Like even in the Naga and the Northeast context as well. But I really don't know much, or people around me don't know much about my culture. And that is when I realized that there is a need for me to write, to translate. And that translation is also definitely about visibility, but it is also about representation. It is also about reclaiming our stories. And of course, all of you translators and practitioners out here also know that it is not just text, but various kinds of textiles also that come into play. For example, I'm going to stand up because we have been sitting for a very long time. This mekhala that I'm wearing, it's called the sipati in the Ao Naga tribe. This is also, by the way, this has a history behind it. There are 5 rows of red here, which represent the 5 days of celebration after the birth of a child and the 5 days of mourning after the death of an individual. So textiles, stories, narratives, I think all of these, when we talk about translation, it goes beyond what we see in front of us. So having said that, just, like a couple of points about why I translate. I translate because I understand and I've understood that it is in fact an ethical responsibility. It is about cultural custodianship. And definitely, as some of the speakers have said, it is also about language, power, and positionality, right? As Achibe says, and I choose to write in English for obvious reasons. One, of course, because we have so many tribes. And therefore, if I write just in Lotha, the audience is limited. But if I write it in English, of course, it's more accessible. And secondly, because I believe that English can carry the weight, borrowing from Achibe, like I say, can carry the weight of my Naga experiences. And also because I look at orality as a kind of, and the untranslatabilities that the speakers before me have been talking about, it's also to do with indigenous epistemology. Not so much of a difference, but it is, in fact, indigenous epistemology, certain words, why I refuse to translate. In fact, a lot of us writers here, I think, have also been speaking about the fact that translators, that certain words we cannot touch, and therefore, we either leave a glossary. In certain cases, we don't even leave a glossary, because why should we always take the text to the reader? The reader should also make an effort and come to the text, right? Yeah. So some of the words, that is why I'm very unapologetic in using my mother tongue, Lotha Naga. And now coming to the last part before Urvashi and Shivani buzz me to wind up, yes, I'd like to do a short reading from my collection. The name of this story is Mchifali Eloi. Mchifali is the name of the antagonist and the villain sort of character here. Eloi means a lady or a woman in Lotha Naga. So the story, of course, is like much of the like love stories that we hear about, unseen twists, lovelorn lovers and all of that. But what happens in the story is that this young gentleman, he goes to the neighboring village to bring a bride home. And as is with the tradition with the Lothas, the gentleman, he finishes what we know as the Lonyaka period. And Lonyaka is to do with waiting out and proving your prowess, right? Yeah, as, as fit for taking on the daughter of the family. So he finishes his Lonyaka period. And after that, he gets married to the new bride and he takes the bride to his village. But on the way, because it's a long walk, and we are told, stories tell us that, in fact, he carried the wife in a chapa, which is like a bamboo, like a cane basket. So carries the wife in a chapa, but after walking for a long time, he's very tired. And so, he puts the basket down, the chapa down, and tells the, like a young bride also, you can come and freshen up. We will rest for a bit and then we will continue with the journey. But what happens as the young man goes to sleep is that an evil woman, of course, stories and evil women, right? Yeah. This again, yeah, is another trope that is used formulaically in a lot of stories. So the evil woman sees the beautiful woman coming out and washing her face by the stream. She gets very jealous, so kills that beautiful young woman, and she enters the chapa. and the unknown to the husband takes a chapa home. So after he takes a chapa home, by the way, we are told that the, like a young bride comes back in different forms, and this is the portion where I'm going to read. Just before the new husband finds, just before the new husband and slain young bride find each other. And by the way, because he's a Lotha man who is very wary about keeping the integrity of women, so knowing that the woman who comes out of the chapa after he reaches home is not the bride that he married home, he continues to live with that woman. Is what we are told. So one day, as the husband went out to get bamboo shoot, he noticed an extraordinarily slender and beautiful Evo near the stream where he had rested and where he had lost his beautiful wife. He wistfully looked at it and said to himself, "Dearest Evo, I wish you could take me back to the day I came here with my lovely wife. If only you could talk and tell me what happened to my wife. But since that is not to be, allow me to cut you and cook a very special Kharchak dish of you." He took the Evo and went his way. The delicate Evo reminded him of his young bride, not only because it was found near the same stream, but also because its beauty reminded him of her. He carried it home lovingly and told Mchifali to pound it into smittens till it becomes srachak and to prepare it with vegetables. As Mchifali cooked it over the fire, the Evo started boiling and making a strange sound. Usually when curry is boiled, they say valalak, 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 but this was not the same sound today. As you listened carefully, the boiling curry sang, "Mchifali valalak, valalak, oyam rapurecho yo, valalak, valalak." She called her husband to see. The man came in and listened, but he could hear nothing out of the ordinary. The curry was making the same usual strains of valalak, valalak. So he told Mchifali, "You must be imagining it. It is boiling the way it usually does, so please don't imagine things." Saying so, he walked out and resumed his work. Again, as he stepped out, the curry started making the noise that only Mchifali had heard. This time, she went out and told her husband to listen to it from the doorway. As she came back in, the same sound started. "Mchifali valalak, valalak, oyam rapurecho yo, valalak, valalak." And of course, the story continues where the two love-struck lovers, they meet each other again. But I think with that done, I will wind it up. So much more to say, but I think we can leave that for later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. And I will keep my comments very short because I think I'm doing a terrible job of timekeeping. Uh, and what I do want to say is that I think the richness of the oral tradition that comes across, and one has not even touched, skimmed the surface. Uh, what the question? There are two observations that I have. One is that large parts of the Northeast were carved out of Assam. Yet, we do not find similarities in the folk tales at all. The only similarity I seem to find, which strikes me right now, unfortunately, is the fact that was brought to my notice because of what you said about how men were the ones, were the storytellers. Yes. And I'm connecting that with the idea of the evil women that you find, which is also something that you find in Assamese folk tales. Okay, the evil woman, one of the most famous stories that we have is that of Tejimola and the evil stepmother. And there is no context given as to why that, woman is evil, why, etc. But it's just assumed that, she is a bad person. And there are a lot of stories like that. So is it because that these stories are being told by men? And if we are translating orality, can one do something more with those stories, therefore? With that, I'll hand it over to Achingliu. Please keep it short because I don't think I will do a good job at reminding you.
Thank you, Chandra ma'am, Urvashi, and Shibani for giving the opportunity. I'll take the discussion further, taking translation orality into the written form by embedding ethnographic texts or ethnolinguistics. And this is done so, I think, with the translators who are translating from orality into the written word, not from text to another language, because they are taking up the agency to re-memory to the personal and the collective also, and also to preserve the history, to empower the voices of the less heard. And so they incorporate this ethno-linguistic texts from the Northeast region. This reflect in the diverse cultural and linguistic landscapes, and this in itself serves as a documentation and celebration of the diverse cultures and identities that's there. And there is, I think, the effort are there, the challenges are ongoing to resist against the culture of erasure and the literature from literatures of the dominant group and exclusion from the national narrative. And so engaging with literature from Northeast India, it opens up a vast avenue for exploring the dynamic interplay among languages, identity, and power as well. And some of the most notable writers from this whole region, they have highlighted the struggle between the colonial influences on them and also the ongoing legacies that's been left behind the colonizers, and they need to find a voice of themselves to assert that their indigenous or ethnic stories are equally important. And also they, from the act of translating, they have to a certain extent demonstrated that this act of writing orality can transform traditional narratives through recollection, through reinterpretation, transliteration, and transcreation. So all these make a new artistic framework for understanding the ancient oral literatures that's often dismissed as inferior and which was overlooked. And the present crop of writers, they question the spatial and cultural contexts of voice demanding recognition for their narrative. I would like to, it's not to highlight one publisher, but just because these recent stories have been published by Zuban, I would like to just say some how these writers, whether it be anthologies or in the individual printing that they have, they are very intentional with the choice of even the title also, like crafting the word, uh, keepers of knowledge, the inheritance of word, the many that I am, or riverside stories, or for example, like Dr. Apam's book, I Am a Translation. That's the title of his poetry book, or my book of poetry, Songs of Rengdailu. And by the way, Rengdailu is the hornbill. And so all the stories mainly are told by male from their perspectives, and they extol they glorify, let's say, their achievements and whatever they have done for the community. And stories from the women's perspective seems to be lesser. And so the Rengdailu, which is the hornbill, it symbolizes honesty, hard work, grace, love, and all those good virtues. And so I intentionally titled my collection of work as Songs of Rengdailu, as a woman see the world and how she experiences it. And here another, the ethno words are inserted in the texts that they write, because uh, they wanted to bring forward in the words or the phrases the cultural context and the lived worldview that these words carry. For example, I would like to use one Rongmei word, koi terang koi, which means a special house or a big house. And this house is constructed at the time of merit feast. Some of you may know what a merit feast is. When a person, when an individual person in a community takes a title, he constructs this house, he gives a feast of merit, and feast of merit again has this one. The person who takes the title invites all the relatives from outside of the village also, and it is a way of giving back to the community. So, for example, if this koi terangkoi is not embedded or not used, then the whole cultural meaning of the community will be lost. And so I feel that the writers, they intentionally, when they either translate a text from another text or from oral to English or any other word, they intentionally retain these kind of words. In my other novella, Lintuang Pu, Lintuang means hero. In all of the Naga society, we have a hero who who defended the supernatural, with supernatural strength, who defended not only the village but also go on to get personal glory also. And so if Lien Tuong is simply translated into hero, then the meaning will totally be changed. And so I kept Lien Tuong Pu. Pu means the father of the this hero. And so when the book was translated into Hindi, fortunately for our community, the translator asked, why don't we write father of the hero? I said that will not be a wise thing to do, because there will be an erasure of a whole lot of meaning if Lintuang is not retained. And so the word Lintuang was retained in the translated title, and also some of the ethno words, texts that I had included in the text was also retained. And I feel that such incorporation or embeddedness of these words will help people not only to read and understand a culture, but also pave a bridge of understanding, which brings empathy to each other, to the different communities. And so some sense of belongingness or understanding, and which will take away the sense of inferiority from some community. And here, the some of the writers even valorize the act of orality, because they feel that this written word is very limited if it is in print, and it does not capture the fullness of lived experiences. So authors, some of the popular ones, Temsola Au, Easton Carey, Janice Parriott, or the newer ones, they have used this, they have put forward this idea. And I think they aim to rupture the colonial discourse and also the residual effect that is there related to oral literature as an inferior to other kind of written literature. And so here also this kind of concerted effort made by the translators and also the writers, it serves as a marker of identity, and the vernacular, the construction of these enhances the narrative's cultural authenticity also. And this integration reaffirms the writer's connection to their heritage, and importantly reveals the ethos and worldview of the people, a perspective that would be lost without the local words employed. And there are so many other writers from other nations who had already employed this and was able to successfully, and was able to influence and inspire the writers coming after them, like Achebe or Mormon Silko and Scott Normandy or Toni Morrison, just to name a few. And they have set off a trend of translation, or set off a trend of capturing the culture the particular community in their writing. And so it's not very difficult for other people to understand. And coming back to the point of having glossary or not glossary, for the time being, I feel that we need glossaries because we means the Nagas, we are at a nascent state, just beginning. And so our work, our worldview, our ethos, philosophies are not well known as the other communities in India. Until such time when we will be, when everybody will be able to understand the word dharma or karma like that, some of the words, until everybody could understand without the glossary or without adding a sentence more to explain, we need to continue to write the glossary, we need to continue to write additional sentences for the words to mean something to the ones who are reading it, not necessarily because we dumb down the readers, but to help them grasp the idea which is not familiar to them. And here, just one more thing I would like to add. In the Naga community, weaving is exclusively the domain of the women. And unlike in some other communities, so only the women, they weave, and we know that textiles are a very important identity marker, which shows that the women, they are hardworking, they are creative, and they know how to preserve their identity and even make the identity of their own community. And in the textiles that they wove, they had woven history, the story, and the lived experiences of the people. And just for example, if you see in a tribal or indigenous textile, if you see this signs, which is not there in the other Naga group, only in the Jalengrong Inpui community, which is a coconut tribe, you will see this. There are two versions. One, they think that these are the wings of the butterfly, and there is another one that says that these are the wings which could be a representation of the boy who turned into a hornbill. So, yes. So, and then there are other important markers in the textiles that they make. If the border has,
I think you could
okay,
wind up.
Okay. If it has patterns, then it can be worn by the young ones. If it doesn't have much patterns, then it's for the married women. And they made it for, the women made it for the elders and the warriors and the married men, women. And so we have a lot of areas more to research and find out. And finally, here I would like to reiterate and add that this ethno-text, it preserves history also, cultural identity also, and it revitalizes language, and it acts as, most importantly, I think, resistance against cultural homogenization and fosters empathy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamei, for that. Very quick observations. When we are talking about translating orality, we are, of course, talking about from the oral to the written. One is wondering, given the richness of the oral tradition in the Northeast, could we possibly also, should we be thinking about other strategies that one could adopt to translate orality? Are there different media that could possibly be explored? Also, it's interesting to note from both yours and Jasmine's presentations that the oral has been seen, usually has been seen as a reserve of the women, and therefore there is a kind of a hierarchy implied between the oral and the written. But here what one finds out is that, you know, the oral is the preserve of the men. In translation, if one could overturn that hierarchy in any way. Last point is you brought out the whole idea about compilations of work that has come out from the Northeast. I think it's very interesting to observe that lately, especially, again, not to focus on a particular publishing house, but if you look at collections of short stories coming out about Assam, if you look at two different collections, you would find very different politics at work. the one that Zuban has brought out. A lot of these Assamese short stories, about which I can speak a little bit more knowledgeably, are very representative. Even if you look at the earliest writers, they talk about other ethnicities, other castes, other languages, etc. But this collection is representative in the sense that they are the everybody is speaking for themselves. And I think when collections from the Northeast or from other parts of the country, when they're being, I think that is something that one needs to think about more. With that, I hand it back to Urvashi.
Thank you, Shibani, and thank you. Those were really, really interesting presentations to listen to, which I was itching to comment on many of those things, but thank you. I really enjoyed them. I think just one quick thing, that the anthologizing anything is fraught with so many questions and problems. Whether you anthologize a region or a subject or a gender or a national landscape, everything is fraught with so many questions. And the question of how do you name this is another problem. So we struggled with those a lot in those anthologies. And we also, of course, were very hesitant about, we did state-wise anthologies. And yet you question the boundaries of the state, those boundaries. So how do you actually deal with those? But thank you for pointing out all of those things. We'll move to the last two presentations of today. The next one is on reviewing translations from the Northeast, and Anidrita, who is a PhD scholar at Ashoka University, will be speaking on this. So Anidrita her research interests include histories of medicine and science, of visuality, and studies of literature, especially from the Northeast region of India. She's also curated exhibitions in Assam and Kerala, and has held research positions at various places, including the University of Portsmouth and the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory, as well as the Institute of Postgraduate Medical Education and Research. Quite a diverse range of places. Anidrita, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Anidrita Saikia, but it's a name that everyone gets wrong. A lot. Yeah.
Here it says Anidrita.
Anidrita. I think my name also lies between the politics of translation.
No, I think it's actually my glasses maybe then, because now I see it, but sorry about that.
No, it's completely fine. A lot has been said and talked about translation and translation as an everyday activity, but when it comes to the process of reviewing translation, it becomes about the text. You're dealing with the question of singularity. Thank you. I will mostly be speaking about translations from Assam. Now, the recognition of the translator's labor and role in authorship has oftentimes, and quite unfortunately, been at the periphery, primarily in reviewing translation. When the question of authority, authorship is something that is oriented towards linearity and singularity. And I use Moshumi Kondoli's collection of short stories titled Black Magic Women. It came out, it was published by Penguin in 2022, which makes it relatively recent. And it makes no mention of the translator at all. The cover is a very beautifully designed black and pink cover with motifs of flowers, but there is only the author's name. Inside the text, there is no translator's note, there is no preface which reflects or introduces the text either by the author or the translator, and it is only in the last page of the book that there is a very brief acknowledgement by the author, Moshumi Kondoli, that refers to the translator, Parvina Rashid, as a dear friend, and I quote this. Throughout the text, the retaining of the vernacular with local words, song verses, often very classical Sanskrit verses, and vernacular expressions, including profanity and slang, shows a curation, but that often reads a little jarring in English. But then, when the entire identity of the text is based around the author and not the translator, how are we to review it and ascribe authorship? In another collection of short stories, Orupa Potongia Kolita's The Loneliness of Hira Baruah, published by Pan Macmillan in 2020, again a very recent text, and translated and translated by Ranjita Biswas, also carries no translator's note. But then the collaboration efforts between Ranjita Biswas and Orupa Potongia Kalita has been one of familiarity through the ages. So in 2015, they came out with this very beautiful collection called Written in Tears, which was mostly about gendered experience of life in militancy Assam. It is especially so about the absence of a translator's note is very striking because the author is an Assamese, and many of her stories are also about the Boros. And it's written with a lot of sensitivity and an awareness about the power dynamics. But interesting to note that these Boro stories actually contain much more footnotes than the Assamese ones, making it, that they're making it evident that there is an anxiety and a representational burden of the regional power dynamics and the ethnic identities. For a lot of tribal languages, English can be a more viable medium of visibility that a lot of people have talked about here. And Assamese does so because it also carries the histories of standardization, dominance, and contestation. In such paratextualities, translation takes the power language and moves it away from the originary speech. But then the question arises that what kinds of authority and authorship are sedimented through these acts of rewriting? Even when a text is from the Northeast, there always lies the question that I think a lot of us have touched upon about how to represent the region. But the region, again, and the local also carries so many different localities within that, whether it is tribal populations, whether it is phonetics, whether it is syntax, dialects. And Professor Baruah, you've talked about glossaries. Professor Kamei, you've also talked about glossaries. I remember Zuban had brought out Eastern Kayer's works, which had a lengthy glossary. And I also agree with Professor Kamei that it is important to retain glossaries in these contexts because English has a tendency to absorb differences, whether it is regional, phonetic, or gendered. And when it comes to reviewing, I would argue that reviewing short stories intensifies a lot of these questions as opposed to just reviewing novels, because unlike the linearity of a novel, a collection or an anthology often shifts tonal registers from story to story, whether it is narrative theme, emotional cadence, or the texture. And this is where the reviewer has to decide how to move. And there's no such thing as a correct review, as every single edition of the book review has shown. But then the thing is, how do we sort of frame the translator or the translation within the text? And all of this within 800 to 1200 words, as Chandra has repeatedly reminded us, many of us in the room. And because I'm familiar with Assamese, I say this, that when it comes to writings, gendered writings by women on militancy, there is a lot of interiority on the mental state. And emotions and the evocative are usually where the translator is challenged a lot. For a lot of writings on the Northeast, the focus of Alpha, for instance, in Assam, brought out these mental states of moral ambiguity, of grief, of victimhood. And in Assamese, it reads as very short, terse sentences which have no connections with the environment or the social context. But then when translated to English, it becomes very clunky and awkward. And while not Northeast, I remember this one book I had reviewed in Telugu it was called The Cracked Glass Jar and Other Stories. And this one story had this very evocative part about how when it started to rain, the children would find a lot of joy. But the way it was translated was that a drop of rain was enough to activate the children, which just sounded odd. But then the thing is, in these things, in reviewing, are we attributing it to the author's skill or to the translator's clunkiness of what reads as robotic? Or is it just a decision to remain, close to the text, to retain that fidelity, even at the loss of psychological depth? In writings of conflict, a gunshot will always be a gunshot. It will have that one sound, it will have that, that hole in the wall or whatever. But say, what about the consequences or the mental states of a knock in the door after midnight that will juggle the space between silence and tension and fear? Shibani, you mentioned about Mamuni Raisam Goswami's. The thing is, when the author is the translator, like say the Mouth-Eaten Howdah of the Tusker or Rita Chaudhry's Chinatown Days of Makam, if you compare a side-by-side reading, you'll see that fidelity is long abandoned, and self-translation is also a process of rewriting. And because we're running short on time, but it's also not every day that so many people from the Northeast come together and talk, I will conclude with this observation, because in the previous panel we had a comment about how review cultures also has to change. And I would argue that review cultures are already changing. Just a few days ago, our Scroll had carried this article by Apurvanand on how the Indian public is not reading as much. And with the shrinking number of readers, reviewing also is changing. What does it mean then to bring the mediums of translation, and what are we talking about in reviewing cultures? Now, anyone who is on Instagram and who is familiar with Bookstagram, which is just a community of readers, post books, will know how condensed these reviews become, but they do reach a larger audience. But then the thing is, in these posts, in these digital spaces of Instagram or Facebook or YouTube Shorts, it becomes more about the aesthetic than the actual reading, than the actual text. It's about how, when you take a picture, how the book is placed. No one really reads the long post, which is often not long at all. It's just a few lines at max. And it might be that when we talk about digital spaces, the critical reading might be lost. But then the thing is, short form reels or less than, videos less than a minute long are reaching a very wide audience. And I mean, to reiterate Apurvanand's point as well, most people are just not reading at all. And in this condensation of content, what is produced is a very passive and generic review, which often makes no mention of the translator at all. So for instance, there was this one book, you had a short story there, Aruni Kashyap's How to Tell a Story of an Insurgency, which had a lot of stories of militancy era Assam. But then the thing is, I saw this one post on Instagram which makes no mention of the stories or the diversity of it and just produces the text as a collection that came from conflict. In this dictum of aesthetics, there is also an anticipation that the text from the Northeast will be a certain way, like Aruni Kashyap's text, either of conflict or of, somewhere from the Northeast of a very idyllic nature, full of metaphors of nature, or the hills, the valleys, the rivers. Again, which reproduces a trope of exoticization and also reinforces the stereotypes of what writing from the Northeast should be. And as dismal as it may seem, we just cannot ignore the role of artificial intelligence anymore. I remember in the last roundtable seminar that we had in August, Professor Romila Thapar was telling us how she was absolutely terrified of how AI had crept in. But the thing is, AI is rampantly used, and because it does not have a mind of its own and it reproduces from what is already present in the digital space, it also reinforces these stereotypes and narratives even further. It is certainly on a very dismal and not at all encouraging note that I end this, but I would like to bring Chandra and Palak's attention here that a lot of the book reviewers and writers are actually quoted by AI. So when you, how the algorithm works is that when you sometimes ask ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini or whatever to write about a certain specific review, it pulls up from a number of different sources, including the book review. But what happens is that because a lot of the book reviews online are only till the first few pages, after which the paywall is there, it's always the same adjectives that are getting reproduced. The stories or the novel is evocative, it is powerful, it is gritty, but there is no critical engagement at all. And I think I'd like to conclude on this level because it's not encouraging, it is quite dismal, it is quite bitter to think about these things. In a way, it's also terrifying, but it is important to have these conversations. Thank you very much.
so much, Anidrita. I've got it right this time. My apologies for getting it wrong. And thank you again for pointing out lots of interesting points, including the dangers of AI, which are really very real, and also dumbing down a lot of the writing. So for us also in a fellowship that we give to the young researchers from the Northeast, where English is not necessarily the first language, we find sometimes that a very rich paper, which is not written in great English, is fed into AI and comes out flat and useless, losing all the nuance, which is really quite tragic. Just as a thing, I wanted to just mention to you or point to the discussions, as you say quite rightly, where do we get the space to have these kind of discussions? Discussions on the absence or presence of the translator in a book, the absence of a translator's note, the absence of the translator's name. These used to be and still are to a large extent, especially the absence of the name, quite political decisions by publishers who showcase the writer and want to obliterate the translator. But increasingly in the politics of translation, they are also coming to be decisions that translators take, who want to absent themselves. So if you have, for example, an upper caste person translating a Dalit autobiography, they will not want their name to be showcased as a political decision. So there is also that. And also, I think on the question of glossaries, writers themselves, at least I find as a publisher, writers themselves are rethinking. And as the politics of writing and the world into which you send that writing changes, many writers would earlier want glossaries of their work so that the work could be explained, are saying, no, we don't want them. So in a sense, the publisher, it's not the publisher's job to ask for a glossary. It is the publisher's job to listen to what the writer wants. So I think that those discussions also need to take into account many of those things. But thank you for raising them. And we will now move to the very last paper or last presentation from Dr. Malashri Lal. And Mala is, of course, known to most people here in Delhi. She's an academic. She's taught literature all her life. She's an editor and an anthologist. Mala, you have 26 books to your credit. My goodness. Right, that's a lot. And Mala started as a professor in the Department of English at the University of Delhi. And her books include Tagore and the Feminine, The Law of the Threshold, co-edited with Namita Gokhale, is her Goddess trilogy on Sita, Radha and Lakshmi. They've done those three, and many more that I will not name because we are running out of time. Mala has also received the Maharani Gayatri Devi Award for Women's Excellence, the Setu Bilingual Award for Excellence, and the Ethos Award for Poetry. And currently, she is the convener of the English Advisory Board of the Sahitya Academy. So Mala, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chandra and Urvashi and everyone. I come to this session as an outsider to the Northeast. And the reason why I want to be here is the recent 2 volumes that Namita Gokhale and I published with Penguin, because we were given the assignment and accepted it happily to collect oral tales, folk tales and folklore and spirit stories from the Himalayan region. So within that, the Northeast, of course, is a major component. And I wanted to present here to the inner circle of speakers, and I've learned so much, as to how, as an outsider to the region, this project gave me the opportunity to meet the insiders, be in contact with them, and certain editorial and compilation decisions that Namita and I needed to take. So first the books, this one appeared in 2025. It's called The Whispering Mountains, Marvelous Folk Tales from the Himalayas. And the illustrator is also from the Northeast. And we decided to publish this with the young adults in mind. And this is also because of the last session I attended with the book review, because this is a new readership that we want to reach out to. This book called Voices in the Wind folk tales, folklore, and spirit stories from the Himalaya, was just released last month at the Jaipur Literature Festival, Penguin again. Again, a substantial portion on the northeast. Now, what happens here is that our first issue was on what kind of methodology and strategy to use to collect the material. And we decided as a teacher, my heart goes out to the universities that are locally there and to the students there. And my choice was to go to the people who are teaching in those communities and those colleges, and to go tell the students to go home, either tell us the stories themselves. These were often students in the English departments and teachers in English departments. And they would initially come back very hesitant and saying, no, my mother says she doesn't. So go to grandmother or grandfather. And that's how we collected a lot of the stories. And having expected only about 60, we got 130 by using this method. The idea behind this was to disseminate the belief, the conviction that we had that the young people need to read, understand not only their culture, but those of us who are outside the Northeast culture should also have, in whatever form, compilations and editions of these stories. So whatever be the politics of selection, there has to be a buzz about it. The dissemination is extremely important. So I will, in the next 5 or 6 minutes, just flag 3 or 4 points that occurred to me and from what I learned. One, the orality of stories often contains a kind of tag phrase with which the story begins or somewhere in the middle. I grew up in Rajasthan, and I know there's so much oral storytelling, and there's what's called a hunkar, which comes periodically. We found that also reported to us from many areas in the Northeast, that the oral storytelling is marked by a participation of the people who are listening to the story, so that it's a participative telling. Now, how do you reproduce this participative telling in the translation and in your anthology? So in many cases, our translators decided to retain that original word, which could be Dingpu, Dingpo in Bhutan, for instance. We get a variety of these things which mark it as an oral storytelling experience. And we kept them as such. A second point that came to me particularly is that the various tribes, some of you spoke about the Naga tribes, and those fascinated me the most. And we were able to get in touch with Naga writers who are based there and who write about the various tribal stories. The variety that is available is absolutely amazing. But there is that variety in other parts of the Northeast also, and we particularly chose to go to the smaller languages. A well-known writer, Mamang Dai, she sent us a story called The Sky Queen, which is about the Adi tribe. And what came to me was that we're still struggling with environmental issues, because the story is about the ocean people, the water people, and the land people. And there is a terrible war, and the water people win because they just flood out everything that's there for the land people. But one woman survives, and that's this queen, the Sky Queen. She's kind, compassionate, so there's no hatred. And it's her garments which turn into the forest, and it's her song that enters into the language of the birds. So this kind of environmental consciousness, the interdependency of the humans and the non-humans, the amity that we need between people and their spaces, these are many lessons, if one wants to call them, that we get from these folk tales, which we will lose if we do not write the folk tales, much as I'm aware that freezing them into written has its own kinds of problems and paradoxes. I still choose to put them in writing because it gets out, it reaches out to a large number of people outside the region. A third point, the mysterious number of stories that appear about the serpent in the good light. You know, they're sort of kind princes, they have kingdoms under the water. they can shape shift into human beings. They can help others. They can take people to their kingdom downstairs and heal them and bring them back. Whereas we who grew up with a very colonial, you mentioned this, a very colonial syllabus, fortunately many of you are much younger here and did not have to face that kind of a colonial syllabus. We were always told that the serpent is evil, because the serpent is evil in a particular kind of tradition. But the serpent is not evil in many stories of the Northeast and many stories of India, including Rajasthan. So that kind of an awareness. For instance, we got a story from the Pochuri Nagas, which is called The Legend of Lake Shiloi. And it started with this giant serpent which decided to place herself in a certain area. And there are all kinds of legends about her, what goodness, what harm she can do. I don't want to go into too many details, and I have a written paper which I will leave with Chandra in case she would like to, or anybody else would like to go back to it. But things like complex spirituality, ancestor worship, the concept of shared dreams, that 50 people have the same dream, don't do this, otherwise it will harm your tribe. These are not concepts that sort of urban modernization and the skepticism of today allows us to even venture into. But when you go into these folk tales, these oral legends, they come to you as a reality. And I'm not saying alternate reality, it is a reality. But you become aware of these extra dimensions. And I'll conclude with a question. Uh, does folklore communicate any moral values? This is often asked, because there is a mistaken notion, according to me, that folklore and folk tales are for children. They're not for children. And they're not all sweet and good and innocent. No. There are lots of violence. There is lots of killing, murdering, trickster figures who will do terrible things, people who will cut up bodies and cook them for you. So these are not stories meant only for children, but these are stories of the spirit world and other worlds that we have unfortunately forgotten. And the putting them together in anthologies such as we have attempted to do and others are also doing, and I think publishers are encouraging that process. The tales are not judgmental. They're not. They are, and they are not just entertainment for children, because they are actually against that idea, the stereotypical grandmother with her nodding head saying lullaby stories to children. That's the stereotype we want to break. So these themes are not about innocence and escapism. It is about the reality of love and death, war and destruction. And much as there may be very interesting ones about romantic fulfillment, there is also the tragedy of separation, loss, grief, and mourning. So it's a very rich corpus that I, as an outsider to the region, have benefited from. And I hope through these modest presentations that we have, there will be other readers of these stories collected by a large team of 25 coordinators who again reached out to their own students and other young people in those regions, living there and participating in an everyday discussion, which today I'm fortunate to hear. Thanks to you.
Thank you so much, Mala, for bringing attention to those two volumes, which I'm sure are very exciting and everybody will want to read them. And they're available now in the market, right? Okay. Okay, so many thanks, everybody. Now I have to take a democratic decision. Is there an interest in food for thought or food for the stomach? What do you choose? Because we've had a lot of presentations, we could have quite an interesting discussion. But I'm also guessing people are tired and hungry.
And also we have to start the next session.
Oh, we have to start the next session. Okay, so the decision has been made then. Thank you all for listening so patiently. Dinesh, I'll come to you. Thank you to all the speakers. I'm not going to name all of you. Shibani for helping out. Thank you. Dinesh, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just because we are talking about Northeast, let me put on record that in 2018 we published a collection of stories by Kula Saikia. And who got Sahitya Academy Award in 2015. So it's just for the record, and also to say maybe it was before time, before reviewers got to know of things. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm not going to tell you which books we publish from the Northeast, but we do. Well, you haven't. There's still some to review, but they're there on our website. But anyway, thank you, everybody. Where do we head for dinner? To the pergola next week? Lunch. Yeah, Terrace Pergola.
And we reassemble at 2:30.
That you can see.
The panelists, I don't see any of the panelists arriving yet, so except for Sukrita and Hina. The only two. Yeah. Okay.